We're not crazy, the system is. Tune in to Madness Radio, voices and visions from outside mental health. Wednesdays, 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern Time on Pacifica affiliate WXOJLP-FM 103.3 Valley Free Radio. Produced by Freedom Center and the Icarus Project, streaming live, podcasting, and archived at madnessradio.net. Thanks for tuning in to Madness Radio. This is your host, Will Hall. Today we have two guests, Wayne Lax, who is a Canada electroshock survivor, is going to be joining us a little bit later on the show, but we're going to be starting off with Angela Bischoff. Angela is a prominent organizer in the environmental and social justice movement in Canada, whose husband committed suicide 3 years ago after starting to take antidepressants, and now she has turned her focus to working to educate about the dangers of antidepressants following her husband Tooker Gomberg's death. Angela Bischoff has been educating and advocating for environmental justice for 20 years alongside her soulmate Tooker Gomberg. Tooker was a leader in the Canadian environmental movement for more than 2 decades with the NGO community as well as within the electoral system. Unfortunately for us all, Tooker burned out and fell into a depression. He turned for help to a pharmaceutical antidepressant, and just 1 month later he was driven to take his life. Angela has since turned her activism to the dangers of antidepressants. So welcome to Madness Radio, Angela Bischoff.
Thanks very much, Will.
So I guess you did a big tour in Canada telling everybody, I think you did, was it a bicycle tour that you did?
No, I actually did it by train. And, I sort of felt that I had no other outlet to speak about the injustice that Tooker faced because I looked to the courts, I never got anywhere there. I looked to the judicial system, to the provincial college, the provincial minister of justice. I called for an inquiry, and then I went to the federal government, called for an inquiry. I never got anywhere. I spoke to the media. They would never refer to my references about the danger of the drug that Tooker was taking. They would talk about the suicide, or they would talk about his burnout or his mental condition, but they wouldn't refer to the concern that I had that the drugs contributed to his agitation and subsequent suicide. And so the only way I could really get the word out about the danger of the drug and how it contributed, I believe, to his demise was to speak out publicly myself. So I did a tour, I published a newspaper, I toured the country and did my own media, and when I spoke for myself, then I could refer in my own interviews to the contribution that the drug had to his...
People who are interested can check out greenspiration.org. That's green, SPIRATION.org. Angela, tell us a little bit about who Tooker Gomberg was.
Tooker was a long-time environmental and social justice advocate. He, from the early 80s, well, even from the late 70s, he was active with the bicycle movement, anti-car movement. He became a local organizer in several different cities, kind of landed in Alberta, in Edmonton, which is Western Canada, in the mid-80s. And that's where I met him, and we became partners organizing in the bicycling movement, and then we formed an environmental group called Eco City Society, and we started getting really involved in municipal politics. He ran for local office, and he became elected as an environmental advocate for one term, but he lost his second bid during this for council. He lost his second bid. So we continued traveling and living in different cities and just organizing around various environmental issues, and found a lot of success in those years advocating and organizing, for peace and for bicycle friendly cities and initiatives to fight climate change and waste reduction, etc. Unfortunately, and Tooker, during those years, he also ran in many different elections. He was very outspoken. He became very high profile. He ran for mayor for the city of Toronto and came second in the year 2000. But following that election, actually, he suffered depression, his first depression. And at that time, he tried a whole series of different sort of alternatives to drugs to deal with his depression. And he still spiraled down into this really deep hole. And he did try an antidepressant drug at that point, and he did come out of his depression. We weren't really sure whether it was the antidepressant that helped or the various other alternatives he did, like different nutritional supplements and different, naturopathic strategies, in addition to yoga and meditation and lots of different things. And he came out of that depression and kind of, for about a year, soared into a different, sort of got very active again and very involved. But then he crashed second time, and that was in 2002. And in 2003, that winter. And as he sunk into that second depression, we didn't have financial resources for him at this point. I didn't have a drug plan. Neither of us had a drug plan or anything. And so we didn't have financial resources for him to try all these alternative, acupuncture and massage therapy and different things, which all cost lots of money. And so we turned to, our healthcare system, which the one treatment that they will cover is a pharmaceutical drug. They will pay for the drug, and they'll send you to a psychiatrist. And so he did that, and immediately after going on the drug, he became more agitated, and they just, the doctor increased the dosage, and within about 2 weeks of being on the drug, he was super agitated, and he began having suicidal thoughts. And as far as I'm aware, this was the first time in his life that he began to have these suicidal thoughts, or it was the first time he ever expressed them to me anyways. I didn't really know what to do with it. I didn't really take it seriously. He was seeing his psychiatrist a couple of times a week at this point. I figured they were probably talking about it. Turns out the psychiatrist never did talk to him about thoughts of self-harm, and just kept increasing the dosage. 4 weeks later, after being on the drug, Tooker saw his doctor that day, and the doctor saw how incredibly agitated he was, and increased the dosage to the maximum, and at the same time prescribed tranquilizer to counter essentially the side effect of the antidepressant drug, which was agitation. At the same time, never did speak with him about thoughts of self-harm, and that night took his own life by jumping off a bridge on his way home. So that led me into a whole series of, directions that I spoke about earlier, where I went to the College of Physicians and Surgeons, and I went to the judiciary and checked out all my different options to try to bring some justice to this issue, and basically couldn't get anywhere. And so that's when I, took to the road and published my own newspaper and did my speaking tour and such.
Yeah, it's just such a terrible tragedy, because what you're describing is really kind of clear-cut case of self-harm as a side effect of antidepressants. Now, which antidepressant was he taking?
Well, he was on Remeron, which is an SNRI. It's similar to the SSRIs with just a slight different tweak. But really, all the antidepressants, whether they're SSRIs or SNRIs, or there's a few different sort of other classes of antidepressants. They've all really been targeted by the U.S. FDA and Health Canada in saying that they can lead to suicidal ideation. So most of us are more familiar with SSRIs, but there are many different sort of classes there that also, they all have been identified. It was actually 2 weeks after Tooker passed away. I was at a memorial service in Toronto when a friend brought me a copy of an article from the Globe and Mail that had been published just that very day. That was the first sort of public admonition by the U.S. FDA claiming that antidepressant drugs can cause suicidal ideation in a small percentage of people. And actually, it's quite a large percentage of people that are affected adversely by antidepressant drugs. We know that about a third of the people go off their antidepressant in the first month, and half of the people go off their antidepressant within the first 3 months of going on an antidepressant. And, essentially that tells us that they don't work for at least half the people who go on them. They don't work for. So, and a large number of those people, one of the major adverse reactions to antidepressant drugs is agitation. And it may be up to a quarter of the people who go on an antidepressant become more agitated on the drug. And generally what happens is that your doctor will say, stick with the program, that agitation will die down, you'll feel better in a month or 2 months or whatever, because that's what the drug companies tell the doctors to tell the patients. But in fact, we know that agitation is a very potent predictor of suicide. So that's really the last thing you should be telling a patient to stick with the program. We should acknowledge that these drugs don't work for everybody. In fact, maybe at least half the people they don't work for. So if that's the case, if people are feeling more agitated going on one of these antidepressant drugs, I would say reduce your dosage and consider alternatives to a drug.
Because the doctor in Tooker's case raised the dosage and then just kept raising the dosage and then just added tranquilizer, and that's actually a really common thing, is that the one pill has side effects or doesn't work, so they add more pills, and then they even change the diagnosis. You go from a depression diagnosis and suddenly now you've got a bipolar diagnosis and you're getting more medications.
Well, in fact, that bipolar or mania is one of the acknowledged side effects of antidepressant drugs. For example, many people only experience their first manic episode after being on an antidepressant, and in fact, I believe that was the case with Tooker. After his first depression, where he did do an antidepressant drug, when he came out of that depression, he went to a really high sort of manic phase, unlike I'd ever seen him go through before. I'd never seen that before. And I believe that was indeed a side effect of the antidepressant drug. So there are so many different adverse reactions that come from antidepressant drugs that you just, and there's also a huge body of evidence, all sort of meta-analyses that have been done of these classes of drugs that say they're no more effective at treating depression than placebos, but they have huge side effects like mania, like falls and fractures, like sexual dysfunction, like agitation, like emotional dullness and weight gain, weight loss. These are very serious adverse reactions that if we can avoid, those sorts of adverse reactions by trying there's a million things that we can do before we turn to the drug to treat depression. And why wouldn't we try all these other alternatives? That's sort of one of the things that I like to encourage people to do. Try everything else before you turn to a drug, because the side effects, the potential side effects from antidepressant drugs are huge, and doctors don't normally share that information with patients.
It's actually a familiar story for me, because my first really full-blown manic episode myself was when I first started taking Prozac when I was working in San Francisco, and it's really pretty commonly accepted now that akathisia or agitation is a real side effect. And this is 2003, 2004 we're talking about, and it's really only in the past couple of years that there's been a much more widespread recognition with actually they put black box labels on a lot of the SSRIs. And do you think that there's a problem in the sort of peace and justice and environmental communities that people really don't understand mental health issues, that mental health isn't talked about, including the dangers of mainstream treatments and including the ways in which we should try alternative treatments first? Do you think it's a kind of a problem that exists among activists?
Well, I think in a sense that's part of what my role has been. Prior to Tooker experiencing this depression, it was really not part of our dialogue that within the activist community. I mean, prior to Tooker's first depression, I guess it was in 2001, and even then there was so much stigma attached to it. And even when he had a second depression, I mean, there was so much stigma. He didn't want anybody to know. And I think in the last couple of years there's been quite a bit more awareness around the issue, and there's been a little bit more networking between the psych survivor communities and the other activist communities. But still, I would say it's pretty distinct in not crossing those boundaries, and that's really one of my goals as an environmental activist. Has been my history, and that's where all my work has been and all my connections, to try to bring the mental health issues to the environmental issues and draw the links. Because generally the mental health community or the psych survivor community are very marginalized, and we sort of think of them as kind of the outside, the crazies or something, and I've, in my own personal experience now with this experience with Tooker, I've really crossed that line and trying with real deliberate sort of effort to bring those communities together a lot more. And that's partly what I did with Depression Expression, which was the newspaper that I published, which is available online on my website, greenspiration.org. I bring in the environmental concerns around drugs and water, and the connection between street drugs and pharmaceutical drugs, and the connection between the pharmaceutical drug industry and the oil and gas industry and the tobacco industry, and drawing those parallel links between corporate power and influence. And I think there's so many areas where they do cross, and we just need to be making those links more and more all the time. And I think it is happening more and more, but there's a lot of work still that needs to be done to make those links.
How was your tour received? How effective was it, and were you able to get the message out?
Well, I think so. I mean, I did a 24-city tour around Canada in about a 2-month period with 2 friends, 2 sort of multimedia activists, and we spoke to 1,000 people. We did 50 interviews. We got 3,000 hits on our website each month of the tour. We paid for it just through fundraising at the events and through advertising in the newspaper and stuff. So in very many ways, I think it was very successful. And our background as activists has been traditionally with the environmental community, so we really got a lot of the environmental community out to our events to learn more about the issue of psychiatric abuse and the abuse of the pharmaceutical drug industry in our lives, and how to cope as environmental activists with sustainable activism. What does that mean, and how to avoid falling into the trap of big pharma. And so in many ways, I guess it was successful. I'd like to continue doing this work and speak more to the issues about alternatives and activism around big pharma. How do we break this sort of psychic hold that big pharma has on our healthcare systems and on our psychiatric system? And so there's so much more work that needs to be done, but really there's no funding. There's not much funding for the environmental community, but at least there is some funding. There are foundations that have identified climate change or different environmental issues as priority projects. But there's so few foundations that will look to will support psych survivor groups like the Freedom Center and group you work with. I don't know if you found a similar experience, but I've really had a difficult time raising any funding to do this work. So how I'm managing to fund my work is to work within the environmental community to fund my real passion, which is doing this sort of more this drug critic work.
It's been the funding situation has been very difficult, and we've been scraping together money. We did actually end up getting a little bit of money from the city, but more in terms of healthcare access and funds that were focused on low-income issues and getting people who normally don't get services, getting them connected with the services that the Freedom Center offered through community development grant. not through the mainstream mental health monies. So it has been really challenging, but we've been able to find some creative ways to get a little bit of funding. What's your next step in terms of campaigning in the future, and where are you headed with all this?
Well, I have put my work critiquing big pharma on hold temporarily, at least, while I make some money, because my life sort of went on hold for those several years after Tooker passed away, and I focused my attention on big pharma. And I made no income for those few years. So now I'm just sort of getting back into the environmental world and making some money again. But my goal really is to do another newspaper publication and to do, continue doing speaking tours. I think it's a really valuable contribution to the public dialogue to actually go into the small cities and towns and get local media coverage. And so I sort of see myself kind of going back and forth, working a bit with the environmental community, making some money, going back into the big pharma world and drumming up some interest and stirring up some shit to get people interested in this issue. And I'd like to really be looking at what the alternatives are. We, in a sense, society has some sort of understanding or some way to critique big pharma within sort of a corporate capitalist model, but what do we really do as a community, as young people, as activists who see a world that's really headed and spinning in a really sort of a direction that we know is not sustainable and is filled with war and terror and torture and climate change and injustice? How do we balance that with our own needs for health and safety and activism, and how do we do that sustainably? And I think that we really need to talk about nutrition and taking care of ourselves physically, whether it's riding a bicycle or doing yoga, and then spirituality, and just looking at all the alternatives. So when people are spinning down this hole of depression and anxiety and paranoia, and I think these are all very valid responses to a world gone crazy. What sort of support systems can we put in place, whether it's like the Freedom Center, where you actually have a location where people can come and take free classes and find networking support amongst their community, or whether it's online stuff, or whether it's information, or what are the ways that we can really support from a grassroots level people who are struggling to pay their bills, to make sense of this messed up world. And that's where I'd like to be putting my efforts more, really building a community that can support and provide some infrastructure and information for people who are struggling.
Yeah, these are really important questions. This is definitely the kinds of things that we're working on at the Freedom Center, and also the Icarus Project is working on trying to get those connections made. And it's just becoming more and more clear that the world is out of control, and it's really taking a toll on our mental health, and we can't really rely on the system to provide answers. We have to rely on our communities. Angela, we're just about out of time, but I want to play the song that you recommended. Can you introduce the song that you we're going to be playing now?
Yeah, this is a song that was written immediately following Tooker's passing and was played live at one of the memorial services here in Toronto by a fellow named Mike Ford, who is, a Canadian performer, singer, songwriter, who's a professional musician in Canada. And it's a beautiful song. It really speaks to, there's a lot of sort of definition in the words that speak to Tooker's life as an activist in Toronto and his work around the election and his anti-nuclear organizing and peace organizing. So there's a lot of content in the song that listeners might not pick up on if you didn't know Tooker, but it's also a beautiful and emotional and just lovable song that speaks to Tooker's vision and humor and creativity.
Took a bike ride yesterday, saw a funny world at play. Saw new bike lanes on a street, saw people and slowed down to greet. Green boxes next to blue and gray, posters for a car-free day. Saw families without a trace of fear and joy in public space. Pedal power in full sway, I saw things in a different way. Le monde à bicyclette. Le monde à bicyclette. Tooker Gomberg never shied away from what had not been tried. With faithful friends there at his side, showed us we could turn the tide on Adam's mind. And Kyoto would not go the way of the dodo, burning passport declarations, buried car commemorations. Robin Hood through town he'd glide, inviting us along to ride. Monde à bicyclette. Le monde à bicyclette. When the king of furniture decreed his actions immature, Tooker took aim at his crown and threw the people's gauntlet down, which some folks call buffoonery. How accurate they proved to be, for like the clowns of Yapery, his stock in trade was honesty, sparking fires mirthfully to melt the ice of apathy. Le monde à bicyclette. Le monde à bicyclette. Sometimes statistics only bore 'em, so he perforated dull decorum, energized the public forum. What else can one do but adore him? Ask yourself and make a list, and for a spell unclench your fist, for laughter is an activist. Look up now, see through the mist. Conviction like a lightning flash, dispensed with humor and panache. Le monde à bicyclette. Le monde à bicyclette. I only saw him a couple times in person where the tower chimes, raging at the climate crimes, with horns a-honking, words in rhyme. We're juggling by a tent for peace in frozen winter without cease. We wish for him eternal laughter, peace of mind in the hereafter, inspiring him as he does we. May we all forever see le monde à bicyclette. Le monde à bicyclette. Le monde à bicyclette.
Angela, we are out of time. I want to really thank you for joining us today on Madness Radio. And can you just leave us with contact information, your website address?
Yeah, great. People are welcome to contact me through my website. It's greenspiration.org, through email greenspiration@web.ca. I'd be happy to hear from people, and Will, I really appreciate the work you're doing, and keep it up. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot for being on the show, Angela Bischoff.
Thanks, Will.
Thanks a lot for tuning in. This is your host, Will Hall, and welcome to Madness Radio. Today we have Wayne Lax, who is an electroshock survivor in Kenora, Ontario, Canada, and he's been doing a lot of public education and speaking, and has a really interesting story to tell, and really interesting to have him on the show. So welcome to Madness Radio, Wayne Lax.
Thank you, Will.
Yeah, so I've been reading some of your story online, but maybe you can just start us off by telling us, how did you sort of first get involved in the mental health system? When was sort of the beginning of the whole story for you?
Well, it started in about 1967. How I found out about my story was I did research for the last 15 years on reading files and talking to friends and family, because I didn't know how many admissions I had to a hospital. It started in 67. Apparently I found my brother dead in a car, and he was asphyxiated, and I was driving taxi that night, and we had a snowstorm in Kenora, and it was April 17th, 1967. And I guess in the morning I went over to my mother and dad's, and we opened the car door, and he was asphyxiated, and that sort of bothered me because, and it seemed like I turned to drink, and I sort of blamed myself for his death.
And so after that, you were upset and started drinking? You felt like you had blamed yourself?
Yeah, it seemed like I sort of blamed myself for his death because I didn't talk to him, or I didn't know he was in the car. And we found him in the morning, and it seemed like I sort of blamed myself, and I started drinking, and I guess I suffered from a little bit of depression, and they sent me apparently to Winnipeg in 1967, and I received my shock therapy and numerous amounts of medication, anti-depressants. And I was a Kenora cab driver, and they used to send me back after about 3 months stay, and I'd have to go back to work with a stressful situation of working long hours, raising children, and my wife also become sick and depressed. And we both ended up in psychiatric hospitals for 25 years. I had 108 admissions to institutions from Kenora to Thunder Bay and Winnipeg, and it went on with everything in the market medication-wise for 25 years and 80 shock treatments.
How did you first go in? You mentioned that you were starting to drink and then you were depressed after the tragedy of your brother's death, but how did you turn to the mental health system? Did you go in voluntarily? Were you picked up by the police? Was it family who brought you, or how did you first go into the hospital?
I think my father took me to the hospital, Kenora Hospital. They have a psychiatric ward of 20 beds, and I think it started from then, just revolving doors from Winnipeg to Kenora to Thunder Bay, and all they would do was give me electric shock and numerous amounts of medication, and send me home and told me I had to go back to work.
So they told you had to go back to work even though they were giving you all these really powerful treatments. Did you get a diagnosis of?
Well, they diagnosed me. One diagnosed me as personality disorder and manic depressant, and I had lots of 10 overdose attempts at suicide. I laid in front of the doctor's eyes 30 days in a coma at one time, and scars in my body from, I guess, the medication didn't kill me. It just come out as big boils on my head. And they kept sending me home after I sort of got back on my feet with 20 vials and more vials of medication, and recommended shock treatments. And I don't know, part of my life, it's gone forever. The electric shock is, as far as I'm concerned, it's a horrible treatment. And a lot of this medication, too, I've did research on it. It said it makes you depressed. So I can't believe that I had 10 overdose episodes of suicide and laid in comas for days, sometimes weeks. And they send you back with medication, home with medication. It doesn't make sense to me now. But this is the way the system treated me and thousands of others.
Did they tell you that there was really nothing else that they could do other than just give you medication and electroshock? I mean, were they trying to talk with you, or what was their sort of explanation for all this?
They never ever referred me to a counselor, or which was recommended, but they never did. And it was just like 108 admissions to psych wards. It took 25 years of my life away and my family's life away. And the files contradicted themselves. Apparently in 1987, they sent me to the Clark Institute in Toronto, and they wrote back to a Kenora doctor that they were discouraged with Northwestern Ontario doctors, that all they were doing was shocking and drugging me for alcoholism, and they said this was a bad treatment plan for me. But after they said that, I didn't know this. I'd never read the files till after we sort of recovered, and they said they kept doing it. They gave me 28 shock treatments after this was recommended not to give me them.
So, and part of the difficulty of you telling your story is that some of your memory is affected. Is that right, Wayne? That you have memory problems with knowing exactly where you were and what happened and all that?
Oh, terrible memory loss. I can't remember when I was a child. I can't remember the day I got married. Things like that. My 4 children being born. I can't remember dates. Even in the files in the psychiatric hospital in Thunder Bay in 1992, they gave me 2 electric shock treatments and let me walk over there an hour after. And 10 days later, I crashed my car. I had alcohol in me, and I was charged for impaired. But the medical part never come up in court where I was. 17 pills a day I was on, and bad memory from electric shock. The nurses' reports in 92, the last time I had shock treatments, it said that I didn't know what city I was in. When questioned, I didn't know what time it was. I didn't even know my family. My sister come to visit me. I didn't know her. And they kept on, like I say, it was just like 25 years of hell. Electric shock, I'd like to see banned like most people do. That have them. I've talked to lots of people that had them, and they got memory loss from it.
Did they give you any choice? I mean, were you basically just forced into the hospital again and again, and they just forced these shock treatments on you and drugs on you, or were they giving you any kind of choice and just basically trying to promote it on you, and then it would be your decision?
I never remember them giving me any choice at all. It was institutions. You can't live on your own. You have to be in here, and this is it. And at one time in the 80s, they were going to lock me away forever. Apparently, when I was 44, I'm 67 years old now. When I was 44, I lived in a nursing home in Kenora, Ontario, and I was told that I can never live on my own again. It was just total control over me.
You're living on your own now, of course.
Yes, I'm glad to say that my wife and I got a divorce in 92, and we're back together now, and we share our home together, and getting along very well.
Oh, wow. Congratulations. Well, it's such an incredibly powerful story of abuse, just years and years. What kinds of experiences did you have with the doctors? I mean, what were they like? What were they telling you? How did they treat you?
I don't remember them ever giving me any films or any. I can't remember this at all. They say they show films of electric shock, and they give you what it does to you now, but I can't remember that. Apparently in my files in 1974, they didn't give me enough muscle relaxant. They fractured a bone in my back. I couldn't walk for weeks and weeks, and they finally admitted to that they didn't give me enough muscle relaxant. So I lived with pain constantly. Now that I sort of spoke out about all this, and I've got numerous stories in books and magazines, and a lot of news articles, now the doctors won't give me nothing for pain. They sort of back me. A lot of medical doctors back me on it, but really I have to live with his pain, and it aches steady.
And that's a result from them doing the electroshock, which can cause really strong convulsions, I guess, and then people do break their bones if they don't have a muscle relaxant, and they didn't give you a muscle relaxant in one of the treatments?
I guess apparently they said they did, but they didn't give me enough, and it broke a bone.
What other kinds of effects do you have other than the broken bones and the memory? Are you experiencing other health problems as a result of all this drugging and shocking?
Yes, I shake a lot. My family noticed my head going constantly. There's a twitch. And, my family give me a lot of support. I have 4 children, and they tell us the way their mother and dad was when they were younger. They seen this, and it's horrible. It's horrible what happens to people.
Yeah, it's just really an incredibly upsetting story that you're telling. Have you ever been able to get any kind of relief or support through the legal system? Has there been any lawyers that have been able to be helpful to you at all for this abuse that happened?
I had 2 lawyers involved. I was suing for in 1996. Come to my attention that there was abuse. No, I'm sorry. First it was 94, and I had $20,000 lien against my house for a lawyer in Thunder Bay, and he told me that I had a good case. And he missed the limitations, and he apparently took off to Venezuela overnight. He left a lot of clients stuck. So that part, and then I had another lawyer in Kenora, Ontario. He was suing the lawyer from Thunder Bay, and he left everything sit in a courthouse for 10 years, and after $5,000 given him, I was stuck in that. So I got a lawyer from Toronto to look at my case, and he was a malpractice lawyer, and he told me that he was not a drop-in for bad lawyers, and I had 2 of them. But he said the limitations were up. You only got a certain amount of time to sue a doctor and a hospital. So I was stuck with that. Really, what I really won was I had a lien against my house for $20,000, and I pursued that, and I argued to legal aid in Ontario that these lawyers left me stranded. And I told them I'd go public if they didn't wipe the lien off against my house, and 20 minutes later they phoned me back from Toronto, and they wiped the lien off against my house. So I won that. It would have been $20,000 stuck when I sold my house.
What kind of interest have the media taken? I mean, I know you mentioned you've written in magazines. Have you been able to get your story told out into the public?
From news media?
Yeah, from news media or talking with people or going to groups and events. Have you had success in getting your message out and getting people to listen to what happened to you?
Oh, very much so. I get a lot of support around the survivors group in Kenora, and Don White's show in Toronto, Shrink Wrap. I've been on his show twice, and Don gives me a lot of support. There's a lot of people support me, and I get calls quite often about the media. I've been in a book called The Last Taboo from Toronto, Scott Simi from the Toronto Star, Out of Mind magazine. With he wrote that one. I'm in that, and I'm in Mind Freedom. It's at Oregon.
And do you, how is it that you were able to recover and kind of pull yourself together out of the mental health system and out of all this horrible abuse that has happened to you? What is it that allowed you to start recovering?
Well, my family helped me a lot. In 1992, like I said, I had that serious car accident after 2 shock treatments and 17 pills a day. I threw away all medications. My daughter helped me with that, and I shook for days. Long-term medication, I could have went into convulsions, but I laid in the bedroom for weeks, and she fed me and looked after me, and I said, I'm never going back to the hospital, and I don't want to see no more psychiatrists. And about 6 months later, the urge for alcohol left. I've never had a drink for 15 years, and I've never been in the hospital. So the support I got from local people and Toronto, Ontario, and by sharing your story, and it helped me recover. And I help people every day. I take people from People First, Ontario. I got 2 great friends, and I volunteer for People First, and I'm on the board for Association for Community Living. I travel to Toronto with a gentleman 4 times a year, and by me helping somebody else, it helps me on my recovery.
What kinds of things would you recommend to people who are maybe in the system or who are facing depression or alcoholism in terms of getting help? Like, what is it that would have helped you better than what the system had to offer?
Well, I was never referred to addiction counselor till '92, and it seemed like the Kenora doctor was not a psychiatrist. He played the role of one. When I had my accident, it was sort of a cover-up. They protected themselves, and he referred me to addiction counselor, which he brought me a long way for a couple of years. And I joined a self-help group, survivors group in Kenora, and I recommend that self-help is the best thing. And I wish I would have had the opportunity years ago to have somebody to talk to. They never got to my grieving, but to the roots of my problem. It was just shock and drugs for 25 years. And you can't live in your own, I was told. And it was hopelessness. I just found that there was no hope for me in my way of thinking. Because I think the drugs for too much drugs and depressed me more. And of course, alcohol is a depressant. They never worked on that. All they did was shock and drug me for 25 years. And self-help, I believe that anybody leaves a psychiatric hospital or ward, they should be given pamphlets on self-help and counseling, not just drug a person half to death or shock them. And this is a power that psychiatrists got. And I can't believe it's still going on. It's going on in Kenora. And we only got 20,000 people here, and they're shocking people right in Kenora.
And it sounds like you really had kind of a miracle happen to you with in a sense, the car accident that you were in was really a turning point. Is that right, Wayne?
Yes, it sure was. I complain about the criminal charge of impaired driving, but I think that was the best thing that ever happened to me. I even talked to a police officer that charged me. He was a guy that knew me, and he didn't know my medical history. And he said, "Good for you." And like I say, I got a lot of backing even from police. They say there's a lot of people out there that if you don't know what you're doing, you shouldn't be in the highway driving. And me, especially being a cab driver, a Kenora cab driver, and they knew my history, they knew my occupation. And here I was impaired in drugs for all those years, and was told to go to work. And I had to support 4 children. It was very hard on my family and my parents. My parents are both deceased, and they never ever seen me well for 25 years. And I know they would be proud of me now. I get lots of support from my family and good friends, and a lot of people read this material, and it helps somebody else. That's what I really want to do, is help somebody else and get out of the system, because the system has failed a lot of people. You come home from Thunder Bay, we're 300 miles away, and I'd have to go back to work, raise 4 children. And it took a toll on my wife, it took a toll on my whole family. And I believe self-help groups, there should be more funding put into that, where you got a place to go and share your story and try to help somebody else.
Great. Thanks a lot for joining us today on Madness Radio, Wayne Lax. And if people want to get in touch with you, do you have a website or an email address that people can reach you through?
Really, I have a mailing address. I don't have a computer. I tried to learn computer, and I can't grasp to learn with my memory loss. But if anybody ever wanted to write me, I could give you an address they could write me.
Well, what I can do is I can encourage people to get in touch with the radio show at madnessradio.net, and then I can forward any letters or anything your way.
Sure.
So thanks a lot for joining us today on the show.
Thanks.
you've been listening to Madness Radio, Voices and Visions from Outside Mental Health. Madness Radio is broadcast every Wednesday, 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Pacifica affiliate WXOJ-LP-FM 103.3 Valley Free Radio in Northampton, Massachusetts. For our live internet stream, podcasting, show archives, and more, visit madnessradio.net. Madness Radio is co-produced by Freedom Center and the Icarus Project. For more information, check out freedom-center.org and theicarusproject.net. For more mental health radio, listen to the News Hour from mindfreedom.org, Wednesdays, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you have an idea for a story or guest on Madness Radio, or you just want to share what's in your head, contact us at radio@madnessradio.net.
KWMD Kasilov, 90.7, Anchorage 104.5.